Jerusalem was dying. The earth shook with the sound of conquest. From above came the roar of fire and faith, the cry of Deus Vult tumbling through smoke. But down here beneath the city, there was only breath and dripping water. The tunnels under the aqueduct smelled of dust and iron. Light trembled on the surface of black water, and a single torch wavered in the hand of a Saracen soldier. He moved slowly, listening. Somewhere ahead, a voice whispered in Latin. The sound was faint, like a prayer drowning under stone. He followed it through the narrow passage until the torch revealed a man crouched behind a broken pillar, a priest, pale, starved, clutching a small silver chalice to his chest. The Saracen stopped. The man froze. For a long moment, only the water spoke, echoing in the dark. The Saracen raised his scimitar. The priest lifted the chalice as if it could shield him. Their eyes met, one filled with fear, the other with exhaustion. The Saracen saw not an enemy, but a man who had run out of places to hide. The priest's lips moved. Sancta Maria, ora pro nobis. The Saracen understood no words, yet he felt the meaning. It was the same shape as his own prayer. Above them, the city screamed. The Crusaders had breached the walls. Smoke pressed down through the stones like the breath of hell. The Saracen's hand trembled. His father had died defending these streets. His orders were clear. No Christian was to live. Yet something in this moment betrayed the command. He lowered his blade. The torchlight flickered across the priest's face, across the trembling silver cup. Then the Saracen did the unthinkable. He stepped back, reached for loose stones, and began to seal the entrance. One rock, then another. The priest gasped, thinking he was being buried alive. "Miserere me, Deus," he cried. The Saracen paused, then whispered in his own tongue, "May your God remember this." The priest heard nothing but the scrape of stone. The last light vanished as the final rock slid into place. Darkness swallowed them both, the priest below, the soldier above. The Saracen stood in silence, hand on the sealed wall. His torch guttered out. He could hear the city breaking apart, his own brothers shouting, the sound of faith turned to fury. He whispered a verse his mother had taught him as a child. "Whosoever saves a single life, it is as if he saved all mankind." Then he turned away, vanishing into the smoke. Above, the world burned. Below, mercy waited in the dark. 4 years of hunger had led to this, 1 week of madness. The Crusaders, gaunt from their long pilgrimage, had reached the walls of Jerusalem. Behind those walls, the Saracen garrison prepared for death. Both sides believed God stood with them. Both sides prayed for victory, not realizing that heaven had stopped choosing sides long ago. The summer sun was merciless. It scorched men in armor, split the lips of the dying, turned water into memory. On the ramparts, Fatimid archers loosed their arrows toward men who sang psalms as they died. On the plains below, the Crusaders dragged siege towers toward the walls, shouting the same words that had burned through Europe since Clermont. Deus vult, God wills it. But what does God will in a city built for his peace? The Saracen, who would soon hide a priest, was one among thousands. His name was Yusuf ibn Rahman. Born in Damascus, raised on verses of the Quran, he had fought since he was 15. He had seen men torn apart by faith, heard imams and bishops claim divine fire for slaughter. Now, at 30, his faith had grown quiet, like a candle burned to its core. He believed still, but differently. He prayed before battle, not for victory, but for restraint. When his comrades cried out to heaven for blood, he whispered, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the merciful, the compassionate. Inside the city, panic spread. Families crowded in the courtyards, clutching their children and icons. Christian, Muslim, and Jew all waiting for the storm. The Fatimid commander swore the walls would hold, but even his voice carried doubt. Among the terrified was a lone Latin priest, Father Mathieu of Provence. He had come as a pilgrim years before to serve at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. When the Crusader army appeared on the horizon, the gates closed before he could flee. Now he hid among those he was taught to fear, reciting prayers in a city that no longer listened. On the 7th of July, the Crusaders breached the first wall. Arrows fell like black rain. The Saracens fought street by street, alley by alley. Smoke filled the sky, thick as prophecy. Yusuf fought beside men who had lost everything, sons, homes, even faith. He struck, parried, retreated. Yet with every clash he felt a question growing heavier than his sword. What if the enemy's prayer reached God first? The aqueduct tunnels beneath the city were once meant for life, to carry water from the cisterns. Now they became graves, hiding places, paths of escape. Refugees fled into the darkness. So did Yusuf, chasing rumors of Crusaders tunneling below. He was ordered to find them, kill any who hid there. That is where he heard it. The faint, fragile murmur of Latin rising through stone. A priest's prayer drifting like smoke through cracks in the wall. He should have shouted for his men. He should have obeyed. Instead, he stopped. Something ancient stirred inside him. Pity, or perhaps recognition. The sound of another man praying to the same silence. Outside, the horns of the Crusaders blared. The walls trembled. Blood ran down the steps of the Temple Mount. But beneath all that noise, two voices of faith, one in Arabic, one in Latin, were about to meet in the dark. History would call it conquest. Heaven would call it a test. And Yusuf ibn Rahman, the soldier of Islam, would fail his orders, but not his soul. Above the city, men screamed the name of God. Below, two men whispered it. Their tongues were different, but their fear was the same. The priest's Latin prayers trembled through the stones, fragile and rhythmic, like a heartbeat trying not to stop. The Saracen listened in the dark, his hand pressed to the wall, hearing every syllable through the dripping water of the aqueduct. He could not understand the words, but he knew their weight. They were the weight of a man begging not for life, but for meaning. Yusuf crouched in the tunnel, torch lowered. He was supposed to be searching for enemies, yet what he found felt more like a mirror. His own faith had once sounded like that, urgent, desperate, pure. But years of war had twisted prayer into strategy, devotion into noise. Now, hearing a priest pray for mercy while his brothers stormed the city, Yusuf felt something tear inside him. He touched the scarf at his neck, the one his father had given him before his first battle. "Remember, my son," his father had said, "the sword is a test, not a truth. The heart that spares is the one heaven sees." But in Jerusalem, no one spared. No one remembered. The priest, Father Mathieu, knelt in the shadows of the aqueduct, clutching his chalice like a relic of sanity. He had seen the Crusaders' banners on the horizon and felt no joy, only dread. He knew what they would do to this city, to these people. He whispered the psalms he had learned as a child, each word shaking in the stale air. He prayed not for victory, but for forgiveness, his own, his church's, his kind. Domine, non sum dignus. Lord, I am not worthy. The two men, enemies by birth and creed, prayed to the same silence. Above them, heaven remained still, unbroken, unmoved. Hours passed. The battle thundered through the tunnels like storms through mountains. Dust fell from the ceiling. Yusuf sat in the darkness, listening. He imagined the priest on the other side of the stone wall, and for reasons he could not name, he began to speak softly in Arabic. "Allah, forgive us. Forgive him too." The words echoed faintly. The priest stopped praying, sensing something, a presence beyond fear. He did not understand the language, but he recognized the tone. It was the sound of surrender, not of defeat, but of compassion. He bowed his head and whispered back, "Amen." Neither could see the other. They shared no language, no trust, no history. But in that moment, their faiths touched, like two hands reaching through darkness. When dawn broke above ground, the Crusaders had taken part of the wall, the air filled with smoke and hymns of victory. Yusuf returned to the surface, exhausted, his hands still shaking. His commander shouted orders, told him to hunt survivors, to purge the tunnels. He nodded, but said nothing. That night, while others drank and shouted thanks to God, Yusuf slipped back underground. He brought a water skin and a crust of bread. Through a crack in the stone, he slid them into the darkness. He waited, listening. There was a rustle, then a faint voice. Benedicimus te, Domine. He smiled, just once. For the first time in years, he felt faith again. Not the faith of banners or blood, but of mercy shared in silence. Above, the bells rang for conquest. Below, two men prayed again. One in Arabic, one in Latin, each asking forgiveness for the same sin, believing that God belonged only to them. And for a heartbeat, heaven listened. The night grew hotter as the siege raged on. The air above the city walls smelled of oil and flesh. Torches hissed in the wind like serpents. The Saracen Yusuf had not slept. Each scream, each clash of steel echoed through his skull until it was no longer a sound, but a prayer gone wrong. Down below in the tunnels there was stillness, and in that stillness a single life that he had chosen not to end. He told no one. Mercy was treason now. His comrades spoke only of vengeance. "Kill every Christian," one shouted, "for every child they took in Antioch." Yusuf said nothing. He cleaned his blade in silence, his eyes distant. That night, when the others drank and swore oaths to the prophet's justice, he slipped away again, descending the steps toward the aqueduct. The air was damp and cold. He carried a torch wrapped in cloth to dim its light. When he reached the sealed passage, he knelt beside the wall. "Are you still alive?" he whispered in Arabic, though he knew the priest would not understand. A faint rustle came from within, then the sound of coughing. Relief washed through him. He pushed a small skin of water through a crack and waited. After a moment, a voice answered, a weak Latin murmur, trembling, grateful. Yusuf could not understand the words, but he heard the tone. It was prayer, not fear. The priest, Father Mathieu, thought his rescuer was an angel, or perhaps the ghost of some martyred saint. He pressed his lips to the water skin and whispered thanks, unaware that the hands on the other side of the wall belonged to a man his people had called infidel. For 3 nights Yusuf returned. Each time he brought bread, water, and silence. He would listen to the priest's soft chanting, to the psalms weaving through the dark. Sometimes he closed his eyes and answered with verses from the Quran. Their words never met, yet they blended in the same echoing chamber, like 2 notes of one hymn. On the 4th night, Yusuf nearly did not make it back. A patrol of his own men followed him, suspecting desertion. He hid behind the fallen stones as they passed, torches flashing against the walls. "Search the tunnels," their leader ordered. "A rat hides here, a Christian, or worse, a coward." Yusuf's heart pounded. If they found the priest, both would die. He had to choose. When the soldiers moved on, he crawled to the tunnel mouth, smeared his own blood on the stones, and shouted back toward the patrol. "He's dead! I found his hiding place. I buried him." His voice cracked with conviction. The men returned, saw the blood, nodded, satisfied. "Good," their leader said. "May God reward you." They left. Yusuf collapsed against the wall, breathless. He looked at the blood on his hands and whispered, "Reward me not." Inside the aqueduct, Father Mathieu heard the commotion fade. He prayed again, not for safety, but for the man who had spared him. "Lord, if this is your enemy, then he has known you better than we." That night, Yusuf sat in the dark tunnel long after the others had gone. He stared at the stones between them. "You are my enemy," he said softly, "but perhaps only because men told us so." He placed his hand against the wall, as if in benediction. "Live, priest, for both of us." He extinguished his torch. Darkness reclaimed the tunnels, but in its heart, something glowed faintly. Two prayers touching through stone. By dawn, the city roared again, and both armies screamed God's name. But beneath their feet, one Saracen had already broken the order of war. The enemy had become a guardian, and mercy hidden in the earth began to grow roots. The city burned above, but below, time dissolved. The aqueduct was a tomb without death, a cloister of dripping stone. Father Mathieu no longer knew whether it was day or night. The air was heavy with dampness, his skin raw from thirst. He prayed because he could not stop, because the sound of his own voice was proof he still lived. "Fiat voluntas tua," he whispered. "Thy will be done." The bread was gone. The water nearly so. Each night he heard footsteps in the tunnel, soft, measured, cautious. A whisper in Arabic followed, and a small bundle slipped through the stones, a crust, a drop, a miracle. He would clutch it, weeping, before remembering that it came from hands his brothers would call damned. Above, heaven was silent, but under the earth, mercy spoke in silence. Yusuf came each night, his steps slow, his torch dimmed. He no longer wore his armor. He had begun to feel the weight of metal as guilt. His comrades spoke of slaughter as salvation. They said the Christians deserved no mercy, for their armies had butchered cities all along the road. Yusuf listened, but felt nothing. What does victory mean, he thought, when every man becomes his own enemy? He remembered his father's grave outside Damascus, the line carved on the stone. Mercy is stronger than the sword. For years he had believed that meant victory through restraint. Now he understood. It meant defeat embraced with grace. The tunnels smelled of clay and smoke. Once, while he left food, he heard the priest singing. The Latin words were broken, barely sound, yet the melody filled the space like light. Yusuf leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes. The song rose through him, meeting the verses of his own faith in the same breath. In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum. He answered softly, in the name of the merciful, the compassionate. The same prayer, different tongues, both asking for the same impossible thing, to be seen. When he returned to the surface, he found the city changed. The Crusaders had broken through the northern gate. The Fatimid banners trembled on the ramparts. Every street had become a wound. The stench of fire and iron filled the air. His commander ordered him to stand guard near the cisterns. "No survivors," the man said. "Kill them all before dawn." That night, Yusuf did not go to his post. He went back to the aqueduct. He sat before the sealed passage, his hands shaking, and prayed for a sign. None came. The world above screamed God's name, and heaven did not answer. Inside the wall, Father Mathieu prayed too, his knees bleeding on the stone. He imagined the Saracen's face, though he had never seen it clearly. In his mind, it was gentle, tired, human. He wondered if this man had a family, a child, a faith that comforted him the way Christ once had comforted himself. He began to pray for him by name, though he did not know it. "Lord," he said, "for the man who feeds me, remember him before you remember me." The days bled into one another. The sounds of battle faded. The dripping of water became a heartbeat. Yusuf stopped bringing food. The streets above were too dangerous. Still, each night he returned to listen, once, twice, until he was sure the priest was alive. He heard coughing, then silence. Panic rose in him. He placed his ear to the wall, whispering, "Stay alive. Please." Nothing answered. He closed his eyes and lifted his hands to pray. "If you are silent," he said, "then let my mercy speak for you." And for the first time in days, a voice answered from inside, faint but steady. Amen. The morning the walls fell, the city screamed like a wounded animal. The sky turned the color of smoke and rust. Crusaders poured through the gates, banners snapping, blades flashing with reflected fire. The streets became rivers of blood and dust. Yusuf ran through the chaos, not to fight but to reach the tunnel. Everywhere he looked, men of both faiths were killing, praying, dying. His commander's voice rang above the din, shouting orders in fury and fear. No quarter, Yusuf heard. No prisoners. But he no longer belonged to that chorus. He had heard enough of God's name shouted through murder. He reached the aqueduct. The entrance was half collapsed from bombardment. Smoke from burning oil seeped through the cracks. Yusuf dropped to his knees, clawing at the rubble until he found the hollow he had built days before. He pressed his ear against it. "Father," he whispered, "can you hear me?" From within came a weak reply, a sound between sob and breath. "I am here." Relief struck him like pain. He could have stayed. He could have tried to free the priest, lead him out, run toward the desert. But the street behind him filled with voices, Latin voices, Crusaders advancing. He recognized the tone, the hunt. If they found the priest, they would kill him. If they found Yusuf, they would do worse. There was no time. He understood then what must be done. He turned toward the noise and saw their torches glowing through the dust. "Move, brothers," one shouted. "Saracens hide here." Yusuf grabbed a stone and jammed it into the gap. Then another. He worked fast, sealing the opening he had kept alive for days. Each stone fell like a heartbeat. "Forgive me," he whispered, "for saving you this way." The priest heard the scraping of rock and thought he was being buried alive again. He pressed his palms together and wept. Fiat voluntas tua. The torches were closer now, the Crusaders shouting in triumph. Yusuf stood, breathing hard, his hands bleeding. When the first of them turned the corner, he faced them. A knight with a white cross raised his sword. "You there! Step aside!" Yusuf spread his arms, blocking the wall. "There's nothing here," he said in broken French. "Only stones. Only death." They did not listen. One lunged forward, striking. Yusuf parried once, twice, then fell. A blade caught his shoulder, another his side. He sank to his knees, the world spinning. The last thing he saw was the torchlight flickering on the sealed wall, the faint sound of water dripping behind it. The Crusaders moved on, shouting victory, leaving him in the dust. Inside the aqueduct, the priest prayed, trembling. Hours passed. The battle noise faded to silence. Only then did he press his hand against the stones. They were warm, almost breathing. He realized the man who had sealed him in had done it not to condemn, but to save. Above him, Jerusalem fell. Below, a single act of mercy survived. As dawn broke, Yusuf lay dying near the tunnel mouth, his face turned toward Mecca. His lips moved, shaping the last prayer he would ever speak. Allahumma, accept this life as peace. A gust of wind carried the smoke away. The light touched his still hand, and under the city that had devoured prophets and kings, a priest waited in darkness, alive because his enemy had chosen love over law. The war had taken the walls, the faith, the names, but beneath those stones, mercy remained unbroken. Silence fell over Jerusalem, heavy and unreal. The Crusaders had taken the city. Bells tolled where screams had been. Smoke drifted through the streets, turning light into haze. They called it liberation, but liberation smelled of blood. The priest, Father Mathieu, awoke to that silence. For days he had floated between prayer and delirium, half dreaming, half dying. He touched the stones above him and felt them tremble no more. The battle had ended. He pushed weakly at the rocks that sealed him in. One shifted, then another. Sunlight, thin and gray, leaked through the cracks like a blessing. He clawed his way out, coughing, eyes blinded by light. The air outside burned his throat. The aqueduct had collapsed in places. The ground was littered with splintered wood and bodies. He stumbled through them until his knees gave out. The world looked unrecognizable. The streets he once walked to morning mass were rivers of soot and silence. No birds, no bells, only the hiss of dying fire. He searched for water, for voices, for anything alive. Near the entrance of the tunnel he found him. The Saracen, Yusuf ibn Rahman. The body lay on its side, the face turned toward the east, one hand pressed to his chest. Blood had dried black along his tunic, but his eyes were closed, peaceful. Around his wrist was a scarf, torn and stained, the same one Father Mathieu had once seen through the crack in the stones. He knelt beside the man, unable to speak. The chalice in his hands shook. This was the enemy who had fed him, who had spared him, who had buried himself in silence so another could live. He pressed his fingers to Yusuf's wrist, cold, still. "Why?" he whispered. The word escaped as breath, not question. He had no answer. He only knew that mercy had cost this man everything. He placed the scarf over the Saracen's face and began to pray. Not the liturgy of victory that the Crusaders would soon sing in the church, but a prayer of grief. "Lord," he said softly, "if this man has no one to speak his name, let my tongue remember it." He did not know the name, but he said it anyway. "Brother." From the upper streets came the echo of Crusaders chanting Te Deum Laudamus. Father Mathieu closed his eyes. "You praise God," he thought, "and yet you have forgotten him." He pressed his palm to the ground, feeling the warmth of stone that had once hidden him. The next morning he joined a procession of survivors. The Crusaders passed him without notice. He was a priest, a symbol of their triumph. He kept his head bowed, the chalice hidden beneath his cloak. Inside it, wrapped carefully, was the Saracen's blood-stained scarf. Days turned into weeks. The city began to heal, but Father Mathieu could not. Every mass he celebrated felt hollow. He looked at the faces of the conquerors and saw only Yusuf's calm eyes in death. He wanted to speak of the mercy he had witnessed, but his words would sound like betrayal. So he stayed silent. One evening he returned to the aqueduct. The entrance was sealed now, repaired by Crusader masons who never knew what it hid. He knelt before it and whispered the prayers of both faiths. In Latin, Requiem aeternam dona e Domine. In broken Arabic, Rahma ya Allah. Mercy, O God. The two languages folded into one another like threads of the same cloth. He left a small cross of olive wood and the empty water skin that had once passed between them. He did not cry. He simply stood there, head bowed, as night fell over the ruined city. The war had given him his life, but taken his certainty. He no longer knew which side God favored or whether God favored sides at all. But he knew this. Beneath Jerusalem's stones, a man of another faith had kept the light alive when heaven was silent. Years passed like slow prayers whispered in empty churches. Jerusalem changed masters, banners, tongues, but the stones remembered. The smoke of conquest faded, yet its scent never left the wind. Father Mathieu remained, gray-haired now, his back bent but his faith quieter, truer. He no longer preached of victory. He spoke of mercy. He still kept the two relics from that day. The silver chalice he had carried from the convent, and the blood-stained scarf that had belonged to Yusuf. The scarf's pattern had nearly worn away, its silk frayed at the edges. But to him it was a relic more sacred than any cross of gold. He wrapped it around the chalice each night before placing it on the altar. One held the blood of Christ, he would whisper, and the other, the blood of the man who saved his servant. He built a small chapel near the eastern wall, where the aqueduct once opened to light. It was modest, stone, wood, one candle forever burning. To others it was nothing. To him it was a grave, a memory, a vow. He placed the chalice and scarf in a hollow behind the altar and sealed it with mortar. "You gave me life," he murmured, pressing his hand against the stone. "Let this keep yours." Sometimes pilgrims from Europe came to him seeking stories of the great Crusader victory. They asked how it felt to see the tomb of Christ freed from infidels. He would only smile faintly and say, "We freed stone, not souls." When they left, he would sit in silence, listening to the wind move through the chapel. It sounded like water dripping in the dark. Each evening he prayed for the man whose name he had never known. He prayed in both languages, the Latin he had been born into, and the broken Arabic he had learned in whispers. The prayers mingled in the still air, forming a bridge between worlds that war had tried to tear apart. Years turned to decades. His hair whitened, his hands trembled, but the fire in the chapel never went out. One night, knowing his body was failing, he returned to the sealed wall. He traced the outline of the hidden relic and smiled. The candlelight flickered on the stone, making it seem as if something within still breathed. "The world will forget us," he said softly. "But not him, not the one who hears both prayers." He lay down on the cold floor and closed his eyes. In the dream that carried him away, he stood again in the aqueduct, but the darkness was gone. Water flowed clear, sunlight rippled through it, and a man stood before him, barefoot, dressed in white, face calm. "Yusuf." He said nothing. He only raised his hand in peace. When the monks found Father Mathieu the next morning, he was smiling. They buried him beneath the chapel he had built, never knowing what lay behind its wall. Centuries later, during a renovation, masons would find the sealed cavity. Inside, a chalice wrapped in a scarf of faded silk, still faintly red. No one could explain its origin. Some called it a relic of the Crusaders, others a legend. But the old monks would say, "It is a sign that mercy once lived here, in the dim light." The chalice gleamed softly, silver and crimson, Christian and Muslim, two faiths held in one silence. A reminder that beneath the stones of war, something human had refused to die. History called it a crusade. The faithful called it victory. But heaven, if it kept records, called it grief. The fall of Jerusalem was written in songs and sermons, yet between those lines lay another story, a secret that had no chronicler but the dead. They wrote of kings, of banners, of miracles that never were. No one wrote of a Saracen who sealed a priest beneath the earth, nor of the silence that saved them both. To history, such mercy was a footnote. To heaven, it was the only thing worth remembering. The priest had lived long enough to see the city rebuilt, to see pilgrims fill its streets again. He died with no followers, no wealth. Only that small chapel on the eastern wall. The Crusaders buried him as a confessor of faith, not knowing he had once prayed for the soul of a Muslim. Yet as time passed, the stories faded into one another. The relic, the chalice, and the scarf became legend, half believed, half denied. But every legend carries a truth its tellers could not destroy. That under the stones of conquest, two prayers had touched. The chroniclers described the siege as divine triumph. They spoke of the cleansing of the city, of the holy vengeance fulfilled. But what if the only holiness that day was the act that went unseen? What if the purest faith was not found in the shouts of Deus Vult, but in the quiet of a man who disobeyed his God for the sake of another's life? The war had promised salvation through blood. Yet in the end, salvation came through silence. When pilgrims knelt in the chapel centuries later, they did not know whose bones they prayed above. But sometimes, in the cool air of dawn, a faint scent of water and dust lingered, like breath from a tunnel far below. The monks said it was the earth remembering. They said the stones beneath the altar had been laid differently, smoother, as if placed by a single, careful hand. None knew why. None needed to. The presence there was enough. In the chronicles of the First Crusade, thousands of names filled the pages. Princes, popes, knights, martyrs. Yusuf ibn Rahman's name was not among them. Yet perhaps his name was written elsewhere, on the page of heaven that records not victories, but mercies. The priest had once believed holiness meant choosing the right side. But in the end, he learned holiness meant choosing compassion when no side was right. The enemy became the only witness of mercy. That was the verdict the city carried long after swords had turned to dust. Because between the ruins of faith and the silence of heaven, one man proved that God was not in the taking of lives, but in the saving of one. Jerusalem still stands. The stones have been rebuilt 100 times, each layer burying another prayer. The walls echo in Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, all calling to the same sky. Beneath them, the aqueducts still breathe, carrying water through the earth like veins beneath old scars. No one remembers who dug them, who fought above them, or who prayed within. But sometimes, when the wind moves through the tunnels, it sounds like two voices whispering the same word: mercy. Centuries have passed since that burning summer of 1099. The world has changed its flags, its gods, its names, but not its need to be forgiven. Pilgrims still come, pressing their hands to the cool stone of the holy city. They ask for signs, for miracles, for peace. Yet the greatest miracle lies hidden, sealed behind a wall no one thinks to touch. The chalice still rests there, wrapped in a scarf that once belonged to a man called Enemy. The silk has faded, the silver darkened, but the meaning endures. It is the story of two men who defied their wars, the Saracen who would not kill, the priest who would not forget. One sealed a passage to save another. One built a chapel to keep his name alive. Together they proved that faith need not end where difference begins. Every generation buries mercy beneath new battles, new flags, new fears. But mercy waits. It waits in the quiet, in the cracks, in the moments when someone lowers their weapon and sees the human face of their enemy. When we say history bleeds, it is not only for the lives lost. It is for the kindnesses hidden, unrecorded, untold. If you walk near the eastern wall at dusk, when the bells of the old city ring and the muezzins call the faithful to prayer, listen carefully. The two sounds do not clash. They intertwine, rising into the same fading light. Perhaps that is what heaven sounds like when it remembers us. If mercy could cross the wall between a Saracen and a priest, it can cross the walls we build today. If it survived beneath the burning city, it can survive beneath our wars, our anger, our noise. Because faith was never meant to conquer. It was meant to protect. If mercy can cross the wall, then perhaps heaven is closer than we think. And if mercy survived the Crusades, it can survive us.